Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to CAUFP members, TD colleagues, and our panelists who are here with us this evening. My name is Jennifer Mankwa. I'm the Diversity, Talent, Inclusion Partner for Visible Minorities at TD. I will be your MC today. So before we start, I would acknowledge that many of us are joining today's meeting from lands across North America. North America is known as Turtle Island by many Indigenous communities. I am currently situated in Toronto. As such, I'd like to begin today's meeting by acknowledging that I am on traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and now home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. I would also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. As many of you already know, TD is a long-time supporter of the Black community, and as a bank, we strive every day to create a unique, diverse, and inclusion environment where our employees and customers feel valued, respected, and supported. The recent Black Lives Matter protests have highlighted the racial injustice that the Black community faces in tonight's conversation. It will focus on what we're doing to advance Black leaders. When it comes to representation in the Black community in our leadership roles, we're not where we want to be. Now, in early June, TD moved quickly and committed to doubling the representation of Black executives by the end of 2022. We also established a new enterprise-wide Black experience area of focus within our inclusion and diversity program, expanded our Black employee network and employee resource group to the US, and our business leaders. And BEN initiated a number of training and awareness programs across the organization, focusing primarily on the importance of listening and engaging in uncomfortable conversations. Shortly thereafter, we made a broader and longer-term commitment to increase minority executive representation across the bank by 50% by 2025, at which time these communities will represent more than 25% of TD leaders. This will include a specific focus on Black and Indigenous talents. Our investments and strong working relationships with groups such as CAUFP will help support these efforts. TD has an important role to play in fighting systematic racism and bias in society. Through the TD Ready commitment, we fund and support organizations on the front lines of this important work and bring our expertise and talents to their efforts. In June, we allocated $4 million for Black-led initiatives and organizations to help address the impacts of anti-Black racism. As a Black woman, being in a role dedicated solely to sourcing, attracting, and advocating for the hiring of Black talent to the bank, it gives me great comfort and confidence to work for an organization so committed to inclusion and diversity. Before I introduce tonight's panelists, I'd like to thank Lisa Murithi at TD and Merrill Africa at CAUFP for helping put this event together. So without much further ado, I'll also introduce Natasha Ali, who's going to give our opening remarks. Natasha Ali is a passionate advocate for diversity and inclusion in the workplace and beyond. She was called to the Ontario Bar in 2017 and practices human rights and employment law. Before she began working as a diversity and inclusion consultant, Natasha studied mindfulness and behavioral sciences to gain a deeper understanding of how people behave and make decisions. She leverages behavior insights throughout her practice to optimize performance and maximize impact for herself, her team, and her clients.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Good evening, everyone. My name is Natasha, and I'm honored to be here today. I want to begin by congratulating TD and the Canadian Association of Urban Financial Professionals on this event and for making space for these often uncomfortable but capacity-building conversations. Up until about 2 years ago, I really thought I was woke. So I really thought I understood racism. As a person of color, I grew up hearing stories about race, prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyping. Those stories and my own experiences of discrimination inspired me to pursue a career in human rights law. I wanted to save people from what I lived through or learned about. But then, while working as a human rights lawyer, I learned I couldn't even save them from myself. 2 years ago, while investigating anti-Black racism in policing, I found out I was a racist. I had just facilitated a focus group with Black youth, speaking with them about their experience of racism in Toronto. Soon after our session ended, I found myself in a moment of panic. Just as the kids were leaving the classroom, I noticed my keys were missing from my handbag. Rather than take the time to continue searching as they left, I reacted instantly to a bias that was triggered by the fear of losing my keys, and I shouted for no one to leave the room until I found them. Yeah, I ended up finding them not even a minute later in my jacket pocket. You see, police brutality isn't the only kind of overt racism. And so, as soon as the words left my mouth, I knew what I had done, what I'd said, and what it meant. I was so ashamed. My colleague called me out for the microaggression. Microaggressions are comments or gestures that feed into stereotypes, and I had acted on a stereotype linking Black people to wrongdoing. My actions revealed a prejudice I didn't even know I had. You see, finding out you're a racist human rights lawyer, it's not the easiest thing to deal with as far as one's identity goes. As you can imagine, the realization was jarring. How am I one and the other? What did it mean for the work I did? Where do I go from here? Do I continue? How do I continue? The questions and my self-doubts were endless. None of my formal education or diverse cultural life experiences were enough to dismantle racism in my own mind. The prejudice was somewhere so deep in my psyche, beyond my conscious awareness, and I was determined to find out why. Although I didn't know why I was racist, I did know that whatever I worked on would be infected by my bias in some way, so I left my job. I needed to learn more, listen more, experience more before I did more. I did a deep dive into unfamiliar disciplines like behavioral sciences because I was determined to understand how I, someone who intentionally committed their life to fight for equality, could be here on this side of things. And what I learned, it changed my understanding of our world. So I'd like to share with you some of those learnings and hopefully plant a few seeds that I hope spark your curiosity to explore these ideas further. I'd like to share with you what I've come to understand about why racism exists in our society today, that diverse and inclusive environments are key to dismantling all forms of oppression, and the unique opportunity for businesses to dismantle racism. My formal education taught me that race is a social construct. A social construct is a set of ideas created within a particular culture that guides our thoughts and actions. What I didn't fully understand then was that racism was so deeply interwoven into our Canadian culture that it's actually embedded into our subconscious minds. Our subconscious minds are like filing cabinets. It stores all of our beliefs, our previous experiences, our memories, and our skills. Everything we've ever seen, done, or thought about is also down there. Because of the mass amount of information that our brains are always taking in, we depend on its ability to place people, ideas, and objects into different categories in order to make the world simpler to understand. There's just way too much coming in to sort through all of it logically. So categorization helps our brains save time and energy. But not only does it categorize, our brains give categories meanings by linking them to other categories. And psychologists, they call this schema. It's best understood with an example. So, what comes to mind when I ask you to think about winter? For me, I'm thinking snow, hot chocolate, holidays. The point is, winter means nothing to me until and unless it's associated with other categories. That's a schema. The problem is, schemas, they don't just stay in our minds. They manifest in the world. They shape our identities by influencing our behavior and affecting our decisions, from what careers we choose to how we respond in moments of panic. Every decision we make is influenced by the schemas in our mind, including our racially motivated actions. So, how do schemas create and perpetuate racism? Well, let's think of our brains as an iPhone. While we have the freedom to download or remove apps at will, or programs at will, they have to be compatible with the iPhone's operating system. We're all born into a society that has its own operating system. So that means there's already schemas or identities that you're born into and take on. Unless you decide to remove that operating system, you just add your life to it, just as you add apps to your phone. So how that works in this society. Our minds observe and categorize, whether consciously or not, that opportunity structures are grossly tilted in favor of the dominant white group. Our minds notice and categorize white people as having more access to quality education, good health care, and high-paying jobs. This happens because we live in a society rooted in a culture of white supremacy. I know that language is hard for some of us to hear, but white supremacy isn't just about right-wing political extremism. It is the foundation on which all white-centered culture is based, in which our society was built on. Our society's operating system consists of a worldview that the white race is superior to all other races because it was created by a few white men to reflect their needs. And while all of this is happening, our minds are also simultaneously absorbing images and messages of minorities portrayed as deviants, undesirable, or worse even, they're not visible at all. This has huge implications for our ability to empathize or relate with minorities, because we're pre-programmed via our operating system to see them as others. And the research shows that eventually, most of us begin to subconsciously categorize minorities as inferior, even if we too are a minority. Living in a society rooted in white supremacy means that we inherit a psychological framework rooted in othering each other, which means we're all probably at least a little bit racist, but to hugely varying degrees. And so the problem is, whether we intend to or not, we inherit biases that we unconsciously adopt, and then we code those biases into our institutions, and then we then allow the unequal racial outcomes produced by our racist systems to convince us that there's something real about race, which then reinforces our biases. So it's like the song that just never ends. But here's the thing, our world is more connected than ever before. Our problems are no longer just our own, or they're not unique to our local communities. We have communal issues that require communal cooperation and unity across all differences if we're going to address the challenges of our time. Any ideology that's exclusive by design and aims to divide us is a serious threat to our collective existence at this point, which is why I believe the only sustainable solution to disrupting white supremacy and dismantling racism is one involving inclusion and belonging. And this is where businesses come in. So here's my ambitious idea. I think businesses should step up and dismantle racism. I think they should because I think they can. Businesses employ about 40% of Canadians who spend about a third of their lives at work. The potential for businesses to model and scale the change needed is just too great not to highlight. Not to mention, the business case for diverse and inclusive organizations is a no-brainer at this point. Research shows that ethically diverse companies perform 33% better than the norm, and inclusive leadership improves team performance by 17%, decision-making by 20%, and team collaboration by 29%. But just having diverse representation isn't enough to change individual perceptions and behaviors or organizational cultures. So it can't dismantle racism on its own. Inclusion is about making the numbers count. It's about creating a safe, positive, and nurturing workplace environment where everyone is empowered to be their authentic selves. It means working in a place that teaches us to truly value ourselves first so we can go beyond tolerating each other. And once everyone is included, we can work together to start co-creating new social identities. And these identities can help evolve the schemas that we carry and the biases we act on by rejecting and replacing the narratives that pit us against each other. So to create these workplaces, leaders need to be concerned with 4 areas of change. 1, internal change. This refers to your mindset. You need to believe there's a problem, understand it, and then start doing something about it. 2, policy change. This refers to your organization's formal rules. You need to be okay to start challenging the traditional power structures that are institutionalized. 3, cultural and representational change. This refers to the representativeness of your organizations. They must reflect the communities that you serve and reside in. And lastly, the 4th, culture change. This refers to your ability to communicate effectively cross-culturally. You need to become more culturally competent to leverage the value of diversity. Each one of these changes positively influences business outcomes, while also creating a workplace environment capable of dismantling racism. So as leaders, dismantling racism should be your top priority. For the rest of society, for us to actually progress on the issue of race, we need to commit to unlearning the schemas that our society gave us that encourages us to only see what's different, not the same. And we need to decouple the opportunity structures in our society from race, because now is the time to upgrade our society's operating system to include us all. Thank you all for your time, and thank you to this evening's speakers for stepping into this space with such courage and vulnerability. I'm honored to share this time with you. Thank you.
Natasha, thank you so much for your great opening remarks. So we're going to start the evening off now. So to kickstart the evening off, we have Samuel Morgenstein and also Scott Belton. So I'm just going to introduce the two of them. So Scott Belton is the Senior Vice President of TD Canada in Metro East region, based out of Toronto, Ontario. Scott is a proud leader of over 3,700 employees in 177 retail branches across Greater Toronto area, spanning as far east as Oshawa, north to Newmarket, and just west of Toronto. Scott has held a number of senior roles at TD, including Senior Vice President in Atlantic Canada, District Vice President in Ontario, as well as the role of Vice President Branch Effectiveness. Scott is also the co-chair of TD's Black Experience Steering Committee, where the area of focus is to increase representation, improve the experiences of Black colleagues, and enrich the lives of Black customers and communities. And then we have Samuel Morgenstein. So Samuel has been at TD for 5 years, and his focus is on executive talent acquisition. As such, he partners with TD's senior leadership to focus on both internal and external hiring initiatives. One of Samuel's mandates is to ensure that our employee base is reflective of the communities we serve, and he strives to be like our leaders, a champion of diversity hiring.
Scott.
Hey, Samuel, I'm here.
Good to see you again.
Hey, everybody.
First of all, I wanted to say, looking great, Scott. Thanks for wearing the suit and tie, making all the other guys feel inadequate on this call. Really appreciate it.
Twice in the last 7 months. I got to, his coffee was very important. I decided to dress for the occasion.
Thanks so much for that. All right, so Scott, I wanted to start by talking about the fact that you're wearing 2 hats. You're an SVP, and as well, you're co-chair for the Enterprise Black Experience pillar. And I wanted to ask you about what success looks for you in that role. But first of all, I wanted to back up to say, what is the Enterprise Black Experience pillar? People outside TD may not understand what that is, so maybe we should start there.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and what sounds like very corporate language that might be unimportant is actually really important. And it's a recognition inside TD that Black communities, colleagues, and customers and anti-Black racism associated with those groups and individuals warrant, one, we haven't made enough progress either as a society or as an institution, and 2, the issues surrounding them, though they can be related and similar to things that other visible minority groups face, they're unique and they tend to be a lot worse, maybe only similar in Canada to racism against Indigenous people, although the root causes and how it manifests can be quite different. So that's translating kind of corporate speak name into saying the bank takes this seriously enough that we've recognized we have to focus on this and be quite accountable for driving change.
So for you, I guess I'm interested to know, what do you feel success looks like for you in that role and for TD?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way to describe it is success is equity. Success is when we have equitable outcomes for Black people. But to be more, I guess, specific about it in our context, on one side of the coin, we say TD's purpose, our stated purpose, is to enrich the lives of our colleagues, customers, and communities. And so specifically apply that lens to Black colleagues, customers, and communities. Jennifer talked about representation. That's an example. How do we, right now, the more senior you get in TD, the lower relative to their population we have of Black leaders. That's an outcome gap as it relates to equity. It's one example, but it's not the only one. from a customer perspective, how do we make sure we are prioritizing Black-owned businesses as a customer segment that we care about and that we're adequately serving? And so there's a one side of the coin, which is all about supporting, serving, engaging Black colleagues, customers, and communities. The other side of the coin, and they're clearly not unrelated, is addressing anti-Black racism. And where I think we are on that, I think as an institution, we do the right things when it comes to obvious forms of racism. And we say zero tolerance for racism. We won't accept when we see racism happening internally. We won't accept it if a customer is racist towards one of our colleagues. And I think that's great and noble and important. The hard work, though, is how do we think about the systemic aspects of racism? Natasha, you spoke about this much more eloquently than I'll be able to, but often people, especially white people, think about racism as this very blatant, aggressive act, white nationalist style, or nothing. And if you're racist, you must be a bad person. And that's just not true. The reality is those are awful forms of racism, but they're very easy to understand, call out, and address. Systemic racism is much more subtle, much more difficult. And Natasha, you again made the point when you said, hey, I realized I was a racist, someone who clearly has intent beyond most of us to address this societal issue. And that's the hard work that we have to do. How do we think about addressing systemic racism? What are the pieces of that? And how do people like me and some of my colleagues you're going to hear from tonight who have the power and the privilege to do it, how do we reduce the likelihood of systemic racism happening inside TD and in the constituencies we work with? And when it does happen, address it more effectively than we have historically.
And this pivots very well into my next question because it only gets harder from here, Scott. So sorry, I apologize.
It feels very hard, but that's okay. It's work worth doing.
So you're a superstar, and lately you've been featured in a lot of articles, and there was a spotlight article about you with the TD Black Employee Network. And I wanted to quote something from you there. You said, "We all have to do our best to respect everyone's intentions and try to be empathetic and educated on this matter of racism." So for me,
and I think, sorry, yeah. Samuel, go ahead.
For me, empathy and education, that's like baseline for harmony and coexistence with my fellow humans. And I would like to see us getting to the next level. And so my question for you is, what are your ideas about getting TD's employee base to the next level of enlightenment, to being bolder and braver?
Yeah, I think the education part of this is really important. And I, as someone who tries to continue to educate myself on this, and I've been fortunate enough to have many Black colleagues and contacts in the community help me with that. But I think the reality is, because of what Natasha described earlier, it's a lifetime of education for people who don't have to think about race. And so people who are not Black, or who, in particular, people who are white, we don't actually have to think about race. Like, we can literally go through our days and our lives and not have to do it. It's not a lens that we have to apply. And I thought, a really specific example, one of my colleagues at TD recently got a Black colleague got promoted into a senior executive role, and he was clearly the best choice for the job, like, no doubt about it. But because we've been focusing on Black representation, he has to wonder in his mind, do people think that I got this because I'm Black? That's not something, no one has ever wondered if I got my job because of the color of my skin. And the reality is, we know that that's something that Black people face. And so what does that mean in terms of answering your question more directly? And what is TD's role in this? One of our jobs is to help provide the lifetime of education and engagement, and that is a role that an institution can play. And it's something that we have to be willing to, I think, understand our own biases, understand and interrupt the system, be willing to say, whoa, we conceptually agree systemic racism exists in society. Therefore, it probably exists in one of the country's largest institutions. How do we understand, evaluate, and address it address it internally, but then from an employee perspective, and how do we teach? How do we actually share and bring expertise in that understands this really well? And I wouldn't have thought at one point in my life this is the role for an institution or a corporation to play. But I grew up in Canada. I went to high school in Canada, public high school. I learned about Indigenous culture. I learned about different aspects of it. But the first time I learned about what a residential school was at TD. And fortunately, I think schools are doing a much better job of teaching the real aspects of Indigenous history and what colonization did to Indigenous people. But institutions can play that role, and I think that's something that's incredibly important. So although I take the point, education is minimum standard, it is ongoing. But the other part of that is you don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to be an expert like Natasha, like Naki, like other people to act. And I think that's another really important thing. You can make progress without having perfect knowledge. We don't expect that in any other aspect of our business, so why should we expect it here?
I think that's a great call out. And, it really resonated what you said, because I've learned a lot about TD and interacted with a lot of different types of people I would otherwise not have. So again, you're right. It's all about the education piece. I wanted to touch and sort of pivot from what you said into recruitment, because I've been focused on executive recruitment for 5 years at TD. And in those 5 years, a lot of times the discussion I have with a hiring leader ends up talking about finding visible minority candidates and finding and sourcing Black executives as part of the search process. And I'm really happy that the conversation is now pivoting from finding those execs to growing and creating those execs. And so I wanted to talk to you about that because I know we have a pool of incredible Black executives and future Black executives at TD. And
yep.
I want to talk about some ideas you might have to prepare our Black executives and prepare our future Black executives for their careers and next steps.
Yeah, so on one hand, development for Black leaders and aspiring Black executives is identical as it is for everyone else. And I think that's a really important point, because sometimes when we talk about talent development and progression, we say for groups that are underrepresented in the past, we focus on the development side of it. And I think that's important, but I think development is relevant for everybody. Again, I do think this is an opportunity for more senior leaders in TD to do a better job of, we talk internally at TD about sponsorship, about getting to know and understand our Black talent, our Black pipeline of talent, really understanding their capabilities, and then also making sure that we don't have bias in our whether, in the work you do, Samuel, in the external hiring process, or internally. How do we actually make sure we don't have bias in our existing sort of talent management process? And the data suggests we might. So for me, it's about consciously having leaders, and by the way, the people on this call do a great job of it, that we're going to hear from later, but consciously seeking out to know aspiring Black leaders, what their capabilities are, and really getting to know them so they're on your mind when you're hiring for that next executive role, and that you can tailor the development for them as individuals the way we would for any other individual in the bank, but for a group that can be overlooked.
I agree. And I think there's a lot of good things happening at TD. And I think there's going to be a lot of good things happening in the future. And I'm involved in those initiatives. And yes, eliminating unconscious bias and mitigating all that are some of the things we do with all our executives as they go into the interview process. And we are constantly trying to teach executives on how better mitigate that bias. Jennifer, I think that I've wasted Scott at this point, and my puppy's now gnawing at my ankle. So I think I'm going to hand it over to you to continue our journey. Thanks, Scott. I appreciate that. That was a great discussion.
Thanks, Samuel. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Samuel, and Samuel's dog, too. Okay, so let's introduce the next part of our evening. So Naki is going to lead our panel discussion. So Naki Osutei is the Associate Vice President, Social Impact Canada for the Global Corporate Citizenship Team at TD Bank. Naki, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was great. And Samuel, Scott, fantastic discussion. And Natasha, thanks for kicking us off with such a great reflection. I'm really excited to introduce the panel that we're about to hear from. I won't go through their bios, but trust me, they are all exceedingly accomplished in a variety of spaces. But I will introduce you to them so that you've got a sense of who they each are. First, we've got Mike French, who is the head of mortgages and personal lending. We also have Colleen Ward, who is the vice president technology. Christine Morris, chief operating officer for Canadian personal banking, and Xihao Hu, who is our chief auditor at TD. So as we've heard in both Natasha's segment and Samuel and Scott's segment, this has been a time of deep reflection. And even for those who have been deeply involved in issues around anti-Black racism or racism more broadly, this time frame over the last several months has been a time of reflecting differently. And so I might ask the panel, in the wake of recent events, you know, the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor's murder, closer to home, Regis Korchinski-Paquette. In light of all of these events, have you had an awakening of sorts? Have you started to reflect on these issues of anti-Black racism differently? Maybe I'll start with Mike.
Jackie, thanks. I'm going to say yes. You know, as I watched those stories unfold and I met and heard more from people like Natasha, I did learn something that had been kind of floating around with me for a while, but I hadn't really gotten it, and that was about white privilege. I remember the first Black History Month reception I attended was about 5 years ago, and there was a phenomenal speaker, and I sent her a note telling her that, and she said, "Can we meet?" And I said, "Sure." Mm-hmm. We met in the food court for a coffee, and before I was even in the chair, she said to me, "Okay, Mr. French, how are we going to use your white privilege to advance my career?" And I remember at the time, it was the first time I'd ever heard the phrase white privilege. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't even know what that is. And over time, as I got more and more involved in the cause, I heard it, and I heard the examples, but I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure I ever bought in. And then over the late spring and summer of this year, as I saw, you know, the horrendous treatment and the number of examples of that treatment just made it obvious that it's not about George Floyd. It's about Black people, and I got it, and I understood it. And Scott mentioned it, right? Scott talked about it. He said, nobody thinks that I got my job because of the color of my skin. And I thought to myself, you know, if I was reflecting now on me, I would say, maybe I did, or maybe it was at least a factor, right? And so that sort of white privilege, being white has meaning. You know, Natasha mentioned access to healthcare and higher education. And I would add, you know, good housing and all those things. You know, that's been a big sort of light bulb for me.
Thank you for that, Mike. That's a very thoughtful reflection. And you know, as we talk about evolving institutions and systemic change, it really does begin with reflections like that. I'd like to invite other members of the panel. Colleen?
Thanks, Naki, and thanks, Mike, for sharing that story. The fact that we're having this discussion and our panel is largely non-Black is exciting for me. This is historic. My life, we've talked about these injustices in my community, and now a large population of non-Black humans, colleagues, professionals, leaders are engaging in this dialogue. And like Mike shared, we're employing a new vocabulary as well. And it's happening both personally and professionally. And this is progress in response to this adversity. And it's encouraging that we're being vulnerable and we're doing so in a safe place. And I'm appreciative of that.
Thank you, Colleen. Xihao, may I get your reflections as well?
Sure, Naki. You know, after the George Floyd tragedy, I ended up talking to a few of my TD colleagues that are Black, and a few of my Black friends outside of work as well. And all of them shared with me their personal stories or stories involving their children. And it opened up kind of a different world for me that I see what I didn't see before, a world with lots of bias, discrimination, and at times suppression as well. You know, as a visible minority myself and immigrant to North America, sometimes I complain about uneven treatment, but compared to what the stories those guys have shared with me, it's kind of incomparable for a lot of the bias and discrimination that's been suffered for such a long period of time. What I think is good coming out of this event is I do see a lot of people is willing to stand up and share their stories and expose their own vulnerabilities a little bit more. And because of George Floyd, because of Breonna Taylor and all those things happened this year, I think fewer people are keeping their silence. More people are willing to share their own experience, and more people are willing to act upon something more proactively versus passively. I think there are clear signs of momentum and progress, you know, in the past few months.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think we've certainly arrived at a new place. Christine or Chris, maybe I'll invite you to offer your reflections as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my reflection, I would echo what folks have said so far. I mean, absolutely horrified by these acts of terrible violence, and that men and women are dying because of the color of their skin. I think it was a wake-up call for a lot of us. And, you know, I don't think about myself as being a naive person, but the takeaway was that I have so much to learn about systemic racism and, you know, the experiences of Black Canadians. And I knew I needed to educate myself in a more holistic way. It's not that I didn't have my eyes open to the fact that there's racism in our society, but the extent of it and how pervasive it is, and how it's been ignored for so long, you know, by so many of us, really spurred a lot of conversation with my family, friends, and at work. And, you know, the killing of Black citizens in the spring was a catalyst to talk and to take action. And at TD, we did kick off those conversations. We started with empathy for the lives that were lost, and also for the serious pain many of our Black colleagues were feeling. We established listening tours, really tried to understand what our Black colleagues were experiencing, and, you know, what we needed to do to help. And I think there was a much more pronounced sense of urgency that we had to do things differently. And, you know, it is the first time, as, you know, Mike alluded to, it is the first time I've talked to Black colleagues about what the day-to-day experience of being Black is. And I talked about what it's like to be white. And this really helped me come to understand the advantages I have because of that fact. And you know, what we do refer to as white privilege, I honestly don't think I spent enough time thinking about my life in those terms. Conversations were awkward, they were uncomfortable, there was silence, but we started and we're continuing. And, you know, I would just maybe end my comment here by a huge thank you to our Black colleagues, because they were extremely generous and patient in sharing stories. And one of the learnings I have is that I think over the past few months, we've leaned more heavily on our Black colleagues to educate us, and then we have reaching out to help them.
Wow, thank you for that, Chris. You know, similar to Natasha's comment earlier about, you know, very, very overt acts of racism versus the way that systemic racism plays out. I think the fact that we saw such extreme instances of violence against Black bodies really spurred the conversation. But what's equally important is how that momentum is being shifted inside of the institution. And the question I want to pose to the panel now is, what evidence of racism are you seeing in the institution? And I know this is a tough question because oftentimes we shy away from admitting that it exists around us. But if we are to address it, we first have to be able to see it. And so, I'll turn to Colleen to maybe kick off. Just any instances of racism that you have seen or evidence that systemic racism exists in the institution.
Thanks, Naki. Interestingly, I recall an incident that happened in advance of George Floyd, which was the Amy Cooper incident in Central Park. And that incident was materially impactful for me because the racism was much more subtle and much more prevalent. And even I think Amy Cooper herself denied that she acted on racism. And that's what I find to be much more common in the world. And it's those biases that many are completely unaware that they have. And that's what I fear if perpetuates will sustain this inequitable environment that we're in. And that's why I remarked earlier that I'm honored that people are more open to have the conversation and educate themselves on themselves. That self-awareness is paramount, and making certain that they're active in not only resolving their own biases, but then they are more impactful with others that resemble them to influence to do same. And recognize, like when Mike speaks, and that's why I've always been, Mike, you have so many fans and many online who are also sending me messages in the background, but you have a huge fan base because you may be, and to be honest, you're one of the few white males that speak so openly and so vulnerably about this subject. And we thank you for it because you set an example for others like you. And that's where I believe that more of this has to happen in order to address what would be more subtle Amy Cooper type injustices that we have.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that comparison, because we often do focus on the extremely violent instances and ignore the Amy Cooper type of instances, which are more akin to the kind of day-to-day experiences of oppression, racism.
Hey, Naki.
Yeah.
Can I just jump on that for a
Please
second?
do.
Thank you,
Please do.
Colleen, for the kind words. You know, Amy Cooper was taking advantage of what she knows is institutional racism in our society, right? Like, she knew that if she said that she was being threatened by a Black man, the cops would show up faster and with more force than if she didn't say that. Like, that's just a scary revelation, isn't it, about our society? It's kind of insightful I don't know. It's just a scary, scary revelation.
No, yeah. I mean, sociologists call that weaponizing of race.
Yeah.
And so she used that as a weapon to ensure that she was protected. Mike, I do want to turn that question back to you, just, you know, in light of what Colleen was sharing about your long time engagement on these issues, wondering what evidence of systemic racism you've observed at the bank.
Yeah, so, you know, I would pick up on something Scott said, that as a white male, you know, I'm really not part of any minority group. It's and so for me, it's quite hard to see this stuff, or it has been hard to see it. But the one thing I would say is, you know, the thing that we all have in common as colleagues at TD Bank and as bankers, we love numbers, right? We're all very numerate. We're very comfortable in dealing with numbers, and you can boil it down to a concept that is that simple, right? You look at the numbers in the bank of Black people, and you look at numbers in society in those communities where we work, and it doesn't compute, right? Like the disparity between those two percentages, representation in the bank, and even more stark representation as you go up the levels versus representation in the community, and it's just that easy. That to me is the ultimate objective evidence.
And I think for some time, those numbers would have been interpreted as, well, Black people are just not doing certain things, or they're doing too much of other things. I think it's in this moment that those numbers have been understood to be reflective of inequity, structural racism, systemic racism. And so, you know, your comments around numeracy is actually a good segue to my next question. TD's made a pretty strong commitment that Jennifer spoke to at the outset of this discussion to increase minority executive representation by 50% by 2025, with a specific focus on Black and Indigenous talent. In fact, doubling Black talent at the senior levels by 2022. So I want to pose the question to each of the panelists, and again, thanking you for your personal reflections, now extending that out to how your personal reflections are extending into the actions that you want to take to support this objective within your line of business. So Christine, maybe I'll turn to you first, and maybe you can just talk a little bit about some of the practical things that your line of business is doing in support of this objective.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so, I mean, I think about these things as you need culture and tone from the top and organizational will, and then you need the day-to-day and the actions and the accountability of individual people leaders. And so, you know, as has been said, you know, at TD, we have created a rally cry. We do have very public commitments, and we're going to report our progress, and we're going to hold ourselves accountable. But I think the hard work is in the day-to-day. And so in terms of my world, things we're doing are using the facts, using the data, understanding our talent pipeline and the advancement of Black colleagues, providing critical development opportunities for career advancement, including mentorship, and this can take many forms. It can be one-on-one, it can be group mentoring, thorough and active sponsorship, not just saying you're a sponsor, but really working with a colleague to understand their strengths and opportunities and provide them with broadening experiences. And then bias training to help leaders remove and understand biases. And then lastly, you know, being very disciplined and deliberate about having a diverse candidates for open roles. And this includes movements within the organization as well as external hiring. And I think a really great example of that is actually the Black talent internships, which Lucy and Mike have been big advocates for many years within the bank. And so, Mike, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, so this is a program that Lucy It was born out of Lucy's mind. I don't know, Lucy, whether it was 3 or 4 years ago. I'm going to guess 4. We started with 6 candidates. We're up to 33 hires now, bringing representatives from the Black community into the bank to give them an opportunity to get some great experience. You know, what matters at that age is what's written on your resume, and having a platinum name like TD on your resume is super powerful. So it enables them to go pretty much anywhere. It gives them a real leg up. They earn some money. And frankly, the talent that we've brought in has been incredible. And so it's been an eye-opener for us, and I think a huge success. But credit for that success goes to Lucy Murithri for sure. Yeah.
Plus, I mean, people get to audition TD as well, right? They get to see our company and see it's a place they want to work. And so really win-win.
And Chris, I know Xihao wanted to jump in. If I can just turn to him for a sec.
Just real quick, is on the internship program. Like, you know, Mike and Lucy has got me involved in this as well. Like, I view this as I'm the beneficiary of this program because I got really great candidates. Each year we have 3 Black students come into the internship audit. They're in the critical area of technology, which we need a lot of help. It's also emerging area. It's nice for the students to put the experience on their resume. It's a win-win situation. So very happy to do it, and very much appreciative of Mike's and Lucy's efforts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Chris, back to you.
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, no, I I think great program. And then, you know, I think the other piece, as we said, it is the day-to-day and, you know, ensuring that we do have people leaders who, you know, act and address the microaggressions that have been talked about on this panel and with our speaker in terms of things that are intentional or unintentional, and just creating an environment where people truly feel they can reach their potential, however they define it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Chris. I'm gonna go back to Mike for a quick second on the internship program, just because I think it's often interesting to have programs like that. But I think additionally interesting is to see how individuals who've taken part in those programs progress. So whether that be inside of TD or elsewhere. So just wondering if you've got an example of a story of someone that's been part of that program. This could go to anybody on the panel, actually. Anyone that's been part of the internship program, and sort of where did that take them?
Yeah, so if it's me, early days, Naki, but we have had a number of examples of people who started in the internship program. And Lucy, you're going to have to remind me of the name, but in the first cohort, I can see her, I just can't remember her name, but she came in and I think she was in compliance, and she said, I really want to be in asset management. And she was a 3rd-year student, end of 2nd year, going into 3rd. She came back in the summer of her 3rd year, and we put her in asset management, and she's still there now. So
amazing.
It is to you know, just to pick up on Chris's phrase, like it really does give these talented, smart, engaged, energetic students an opportunity to audition TD. And they love it, right? And they go where they want to go. And that's so critical at that stage in your career. So we have a very, very high, I think the last stat in terms of continuity was 73%. So 3/4 of our students return to the bank. It's got momentum. It's got lots of momentum.
That's an awesome story. And I think what I also love about that story is clearly there was a level of safety, of psychological safety, such that that student felt comfortable to really express what it was that she wanted, and that we were then able to deliver. So that's awesome. Colleen, I'm going to turn to you because I know that there's some interesting initiatives coming out of technology in support of these objectives. So maybe you can talk a little bit about those.
Interestingly, technology was vested in this well before #Black was trending. We've established some wonderful relationships with many third parties, and we've been cultivating talent quite actively in the Black tech space. Recently, with the establishment of our Black Experience pillar this summer, I've been asked to lead it for our broader group beyond technology. And so we do have a number of great relationships like CAUFP, of course, and BPTN, and as well most recently signed with Black House. And we are curating a wonderful program, and several activations are en route, and we're very excited. And they do focus immediately on the representation targets and goals that we have, particularly at executive level. So one of the programs that I'm most connected to, much of what Chris described, in fact, is what we're doing in our space, but there is one where we have asked all our SVP Plus leaders to partner with a senior Black leader and provide what we're calling executive career counseling. And they would spend 1 year with that colleague and their direct leader as well. And they would work on, and this would be just a mentorship program, this is very hands-on. And the intention is that this SVP Plus leader provide opportunities for networking, for providing them actively involved in their career development, and that may include curriculums or maybe stretch assignments, or even cultivating sponsors, authentic sponsorship relationships throughout this as well. So I'm so energized, and we're kicking this off in November, and they would participate in performance reviews as well, year-end reviews, mid-year reviews. They would be able to help build the Black leaders' narrative as well. I think sometimes our confidence with showcasing our transferable skills and some of the soft skills that we have just innately, like our resilience, which is core to our DNA, and making certain we represent that as something as a professional advantage as well, and just being innovative, creative, critical thinking, all those things that I think we often take for granted, and have that bus leader engage with them and help bolster their confidence and help with their narrative as well. So I'm very excited, and it's across all of ITS for those of us in CDC. But there's much happening, and we're definitely taking, striving and pushing forward with much activity for all to appreciate.
Thank you very much for that. I think the particular example of the SVPs pairing with a senior Black leader is a really powerful way of cultivating the kinds of relationships that then lead to sponsorship. So thank you for that particular tidbit, but at the whole story as well. I'm gonna ask either Xihao or Mike if they've got particular examples within their business lines that they want to share. Actions or yeah, go for it.
Like one of the things I think is just to build a good talent pool, both externally and internally. And so externally, just go out there and meeting with different people. I think when I assumed this role as the chief auditor for the bank, Mike introduced me to the Canadian Association of Urban Finance Professionals to Merrill. So now it's really activities I participated. When I was able to travel to Toronto, I get a chance to meet with a good pool of talent outside of TD as well. So if there's any positions, executive positions opening up on my business line, and where we're looking outside for talent, I know who to reach out to because I have a bunch of names, bunch of resumes that I'm socializing with. So I think that's a great way of getting talent into your Rolodex to say, who can I call from a Black talent, Indigenous talent perspective. And internally, I think what we need to do more from a retention perspective to keep our Black and Indigenous talent in place is to what Colleen said, give those talent stretch assignments, give them opportunities to participate in hypo training program that the bank has set up, and or giving them dedicated coaching opportunities to pay for those. To let them grow and improve in areas that they need to improve. So all of those will be important to build internal talent pools. So then when I do have a position open up at the AVP, VP, or SVP level, I have abundant names and talents to choose from.
Thank you for that example. I mean, certainly it's very encouraging to hear that, because oftentimes people think, oh, when I give my resume to someone or I ask someone to hold my resume for a while, it just goes into a trash bin. So to actually hear that you're holding on to them and you're referencing them as you're going through your searches, it's fantastic and a great example for others. Mike, I'm going to turn to you for any additional comments on tactics or programs that you think that can be helpful towards reaching our goals.
You know, Naki, I was talking to Scott about this about a couple of weeks ago, and he said what I think is the truth. And he said, cracking the representation problem is going to be a grind. And it is a grind. And I have 2 roles open right now. And all the names that come to me are white males. And it's just, I'm just not going there, you know what I mean? And I think my answer to your question is I don't have a good answer I don't have a succinct program, but I am resolved to fix it when I have the opportunity to fix it. And I am not filling a role until I've seen some good Black candidates in the pool from which I'm selecting. And if I don't select the Black candidate, I'm going to have a very good reason, like somebody's going to have to be head and shoulders above. And frankly, that's just not the way it goes. You know, one of the learnings as we go through this process is that people are good, like people are talented, and you don't get into the bank unless that is the case. And that has nothing to do with the color of your skin. You're either good and you're in here. And in many ways, you know, the Black people that are working at the bank are better because they have that extra obstacle to overcome. And so I don't have a very good answer for this program or that program, but my answer is resolve.
Listen, that's a great answer. Resolve is a great answer, because it's through, I mean, I've seen it so many times where it's because of that kind of resolve that people just keep looking. They say, well, what about that corner? Have we looked in that corner? What about this organization? Have we looked here? And it doesn't happen without that kind of resolve. So a fantastic answer. Fantastic answers all around from our panel.
I know I'm not on the panel, I know, but I just want to cut in on that one.
Panel bomber.
The job of Chris, of Mike, of me, of Xihao, of Colleen, but especially allies, is to create the resolve in our colleagues, our senior colleagues who may not already have it, because that's, I think, how the momentum multiplies.
Yeah. No, thanks for that ad, Scott. Very, very true. I know we're coming up against the end of our time, so I want to close with a final question for each of our panelists. And Colleen, I'm going to start with you. So I'm putting you on notice. Describe in one sentence how you would want your world to look like, how you would like your world to look different as it pertains to the experiences and opportunities of Black colleagues as a result of your leadership.
Is my audio okay?
Fabulous.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. One sentence is difficult, as you know, but I think we've been given an opportunity to stitch a new garment, and that garment fits all of humanity. And I'm looking forward to all of us enjoying it, and with resolve and tons of talent out there. There's no shortage, trust me, I know. And with some of our colleagues on this panel who grace metropolis corners like Yonge and Dundas on big lit billboards, we are surrounded with incredible talent, and it's an honor and pleasure to be amongst them all, and I know we will thrive, and I thank everyone.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Xihao, how do you want to see the world look different?
Well, I'd like to plagiarize from Scott. I think he said earlier, success is equality. I'd like to see that as the ultimate world. But one thing on talent, I think one of the banking executives recently said, he couldn't promote Black executives because there's not enough Black talent. I hope the world tomorrow would never hear that excuse ever again. We do not need that excuse, and we cannot afford that excuse.
Wow, thank you so much for that. And I just want to, I think Scott had said success is equity. I just want to make that clarification. But thank you for that. I think. No, it's all good. But I very much appreciate your comments about the depth of the Black talent pool. Thank you very much. Chris, over to you. One sentence. How do you want to see the world look different?
Yeah, one sentence. That we're known as a destination for Black colleagues, a place that they can grow their careers, they can be ambitious, they can succeed, and they feel included and embraced.
Fantastic. Fantastic aspiration. Thanks, Chris. Mike, I'm going to give you the last word on the future.
Am I limited? Am I still limited to one sentence? That's kind of hard for me.
I think you've seen that I've been a bit flexible on that, so.
Yeah. You know, we're all watching the same news these days, you know, and it's dominated by what's going on in the U.S. on every front: the election, the George Floyd, the Supreme Court. Everything is dominated. And when I watch the news a lot, I feel shame as a white man, right? And I don't want to feel that shame anymore. That's my sentence.
Thank you for that, Mike. That hit, definitely. This has been a fantastic conversation. I think I really want to thank the panelists for your personal reflections, for your vulnerability, for your honesty, and for the tools that you've shared with us, the examples that you've shared, but most importantly, your commitment. I think what has really shone through this conversation is the level of commitment that each of you is bringing to this work and to this discussion and to this drive for change. So I want to thank you. I commend you. I'm grateful that we've got leaders like you at TD, all of the leaders that have spoken tonight. And I just want to, again, encourage us all to keep going. Let's not let this moment pass us. Let's stitch the new garment, as Colleen has shared, and let's change our operating system. Back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Naki.
Thank you, Naki.
Thank you.
Thanks, Naki.
So I'll just do the quick closing remarks. I don't have much to say. I think Naki did a really good roundup of the panel. I sit on a lot of these panels lately as president of CAUFP. I get to host many of them for many FIs, and I have to commend every single person that's been on the panel this evening. This has been the most authentic conversation that we've seen, and I think I speak for all of the members who are watching that this evening. So a heartfelt thank you from myself and all of the organization. TD has been a supporter of the Black community long before it was popular, long before it was trending. During times when I started my presidency and we were, struggling to get support, but we could always count on TD to help us. And just during my tenure alone, we've been able to impact the lives of over 2,000 Black professionals. We've been able to, bring in over 300 students from across Canada, representing over 50 schools, to participate in our youth summit, all because of TD's financial contribution. And this even stems back to, events that we've had, such as the Black on Bay Gala, where TD was, the first FI to help us celebrate and highlight and elevate Black excellence on Bay Street and give us a home for that. So thank you for your continued commitment. Thank you for your support to Mike, to Lucy, to Naki, Scott, Xihao, Christine, Colleen, and Jennifer, and Sam, and everyone on the panel this evening. Thank you guys for being a leader on Bay Street when it comes to the Black community and genuinely caring about us before it was something that was quote unquote popular. I hope for everybody watching that you found this evening's conversation insightful. I know that there's probably going to be over 200 people sending Jennifer resumes now because everybody's going to want to get TD after hearing this. So she's going to be a busy lady. But thank you very much. And to everyone out there, I hope you're all safe, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you.